The wind was calm that morning, but it carried a sharpness in the air, the kind that reminded people it was Veterans Day. At the front gate of Fort Grantham, the flag rustled in the breeze, casting long shadows on the concrete as the sun broke over the horizon. The world moved on as usual, cars pulling into the base, young soldiers joking, the buzz of radios flickering through static. And then, quietly, he came. Elijah Monroe walked slowly but upright, his back straight like the barrel of a rifle, his steps deliberate, measured. He wore a clean pair of khakis, polished loafers, and a pressed brown wool jacket buttoned carefully over a crisp shirt. In one hand, he held a cane not out of necessity but as a quiet symbol, carved with careful detail. In the other, tucked under his arm, was a thin envelope, sealed, slightly bent at the corners, as if it had been carried for years waiting for the right moment. On his head sat a soft brown fedora, faded at the brim, pulled low to shade his eyes, eyes that had seen fire, blood, smoke, and silence. Eyes that had once scanned battlefields but now looked only forward. No one knew his name as he approached the gate. No one recognized the weight he carried. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm and even, as he extended his hand to the guard. The ID he offered was old, creased at the corners, the lamination yellowed. He handed it to a young lieutenant who looked barely older than the boots he wore. Lieutenant Mason Rusk was 28, confident, with a jawline sharp enough to cut arrogance out of thin air. He took the card between two fingers, as though it might crumble or carry a virus. One glance at it, and he smirked. "Sir," Rusk began, exaggerating the word, "this ID expired in 1990. You can't just walk onto a base with something that looks like it came out of a cereal box." Elijah stood silently, neither reacting nor retreating. His hand, still resting on the head of the cane, didn't tremble. His face didn't twitch. He simply waited, not with expectation, but with patience, the kind learned only through decades of watching the world pass you by. Inside the checkpoint booth, Sergeant Kylie Baines leaned out, sipping from a coffee cup, amused by the scene. "Let me guess," she said, half laughing, "another war hero from the Reagan era with stories to tell and a souvenir ID to prove it?" The guards chuckled. One of them mimicked a limp. Another pretended to squint like an old man. Rusk waved the card in the air, flashing it like a playing card. "Maybe you're heading to the museum down the road. They take these, don't they?" Elijah said nothing. Slowly, he extended his hand again to take the ID back. There was no bitterness in his movements, just dignity. He nodded once, turned, and began walking back toward the parking lot. No insults, no demands. Just silence. Private Elio Torres, stationed inside the booth, leaned against the back wall with his arms crossed. Unlike the others, he hadn't laughed. He hadn't spoken. His eyes were fixed on the man as he walked away. Torres said nothing, but a quiet discomfort stirred in him like a whisper at the back of his mind. Something wasn't right. Or maybe it was too right. The way the old man carried himself didn't scream fraud or fantasy. It screamed memory. Rusk scoffed and dropped the ID into a bin marked invalid credentials. "Man, the stories these guys try to sell." Torres still didn't speak. He stepped out of the booth and watched as Elijah reached the bench under a sycamore tree just outside the lot. He sat carefully, hat removed, resting it gently on his lap. He didn't look back once. He didn't flinch or frown or even fidget. He simply existed, quiet, still, like an old statue carved from reverence itself. Torres's mind flashed to his grandfather, who had served in Korea. Abuelo never talked about it unless pushed, and even then, his voice would change, slow down, lower, like each word cost something. Elijah reminded Torres of that same weight. The kind of weight a man doesn't show off. The kind he carries alone. That was painful, Torres muttered under his breath. Rusk chuckled, leaning against the booth. "You really think that guy was for real?" he asked, not expecting an answer. That ID looked like it had been through Desert Storm inside a dishwasher. Another guard snorted, he probably taught hand-to-hand combat to Chuck Norris. More laughter. A few guards from nearby posts came over to join the mockery, tossing in their own cheap shots. One even pretended to limp with a cane. Another said, maybe he's writing a book, how I faked my way into a memorial. They laughed louder, but Torres couldn't. He kept staring at the man by the tree. There was something in the way Elijah removed his hat, the way he looked at the sky. It wasn't sadness. It was duty. Stillness with purpose. Torres squinted and noticed something engraved into the old man's cane. A symbol, small and faint but unmistakable, the eagle, globe, and anchor. The emblem of the United States Marine Corps. And not the decorative kind sold at military surplus stores. This was real. Worn into the wood by years of use, not by a laser printer. His stomach turned. Without a word, Torres pulled out his phone and tapped his cousin Jordan's number. Jordan worked in civilian logistics near Arlington, had some quiet access to personnel archives. If anyone could find out who this man was, he could. As the phone rang, Torres glanced again toward the bench. Elijah Monroe sat motionless, eyes fixed forward, as if waiting not for a call or an apology, but for time itself to catch up and remember. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The laughter in the checkpoint booth hadn't died down. It echoed like ripples on still water, feeding on itself, growing louder with each retelling. Lieutenant Mason Rusk leaned back in his chair, arms folded behind his head, basking in the attention of his fellow guards. He repeated his version of the encounter for the third time, embellishing it further each time. He handed it to me like he was presenting the Medal of Honor, he laughed. That thing looked like it came out of a cereal box in 1985. I half expected it to have a prize in the back. Sergeant Kylie Baines sipped her coffee and shook her head. Some of these old-timers think they can walk onto any base just because they once mopped a deck on a destroyer. That ID? It didn't even scan. Like. Literally no barcode. Just a name, rank, and a photo that looked like it was taken during Woodstock. Corporal Lenny Shaw, the newest addition to the gate team, grinned. I thought he was lost. Like maybe he was looking for a senior center or something. Who comes dressed like that and expects to just stroll onto Fort Grantham? He even had a cane, for crying out loud. Private Danielle Moore giggled and added, maybe he watched too many war documentaries and thought he'd test his acting chops. Probably rehearsed that entrance all night. The jokes came easy. Too easy. And with every jab, the old man sitting quietly under the tree seemed more distant, more fictional in their minds. They weren't mocking a person anymore. They were mocking an image, a harmless ghost from a forgotten time. But Private Elio Torres didn't join in. He stood at the edge of the room, arms crossed, jaw tight, staring out the booth window. Elijah Monroe hadn't moved. Still seated, hat in his lap, back straight, cane resting lightly at his side. There was something about the stillness of the man that unsettled Torres. Not in a threatening way, but in the way a mountain unsettles you when you finally realize just how long it's been standing there. Torres's phone buzzed in his pocket. He checked it, hoping for a response from his cousin Jordan, but it was just a notification from a news app. He ignored it and went back to watching Elijah. The sun had shifted, casting a longer shadow over the bench. Still, Elijah didn't flinch. You really think that guy was something? Shaw asked, noticing Torres's stare. Come on, man. He didn't even say anything when we turned him away. Just nodded like we were the ones in charge of history. Torres didn't answer. His thoughts drifted back to his grandfather, Abuelo Miguel, who never wore his medals and barely spoke of Korea. When he did, it was only in short fragments, whispered late at night when he thought no one was listening. Torres had caught him once, staring at an old photograph, his fingers tracing the edge of a dog tag, eyes red with memories. That same haunted silence now sat on the bench just outside their gate, and Torres could feel it in his bones. "There's something off about this," Torres finally said, more to himself than to the room. Baines raised an eyebrow. "What, you think he's legit? That he just forgot to renew his ID for the last 30 years and figured now's the time?" "No," Torres replied, turning to face them. "I think he didn't forget anything. I think he came exactly the way he meant to." Rusk scoffed. "You getting sentimental on us, Torres? Look, I get it. We're all supposed to respect the uniform, the history, the whole 9 yards. But we've also got protocols. If we let every old man with a story stroll in, we'd have a line of ghost soldiers halfway to the next town." "Maybe," Torres replied, his voice steady. "But ghosts don't carry Marine Corps canes with real emblems carved into the wood. Not the fake ones from surplus shops, the real ones. You'd know the difference if you looked close." Moore frowned, suddenly uncomfortable. "You sure?" "I saw it. Eagle, globe, and anchor. The details were too sharp, too worn in to be decorative. That cane's been held in drills, in ceremonies. It's seen action, or at least memory." The room went quiet for a moment. "Well, maybe he was a Marine," Rusk allowed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Still doesn't explain why he thought that ID would work." "Maybe it was never about the ID," Torres said, eyes back on Elijah. "Maybe it was about seeing if anyone remembered." Baines smirked. "What, like a test?" "Maybe not even that," Torres replied. "Maybe he just wanted to come pay respects. Maybe he didn't need us to open the gate. He just hoped we'd recognize what we were seeing." The silence thickened. From the edge of the room, a young communications officer named Trent Michaels had been listening quietly. He'd seen the post on the internal forum a few minutes earlier, a blurry photo of Elijah Monroe taken through the booth glass, captioned simply, "Does anyone know this vet? Turned away this morning. Mess hall says he saved lives in '82. Trent read the post again, then looked out at the man under the tree. He raised his phone and took a clearer photo, sending it to the base's internal network with a new caption, "Can someone confirm identity? May have significance beyond what we realized." He didn't expect the post to go far. He didn't expect it to change anything. But within 5 minutes, comments began appearing. Then direct messages. Then a ping from an admin requesting immediate verification. And still, outside, Elijah Monroe remained motionless, as if he knew that when truth arrives, it arrives without hurry. Back inside the booth, Torres's phone finally buzzed again. This time it was Jordan. One line. "Run the name again. Quietly. Trust me, this isn't just anyone." Torres's heart skipped. And just outside, the wind shifted. The flag overhead tugged slightly harder against its rope, the shadows bending just a little farther across the pavement. Elijah didn't move, but something unseen had started to stir. Something big was coming. The mess hall bustled with its usual Veterans Day rhythm, batches of eggs sizzling on hot griddles, the hum of industrial mixers whipping batter, the clink of trays being stacked. Deborah Lane stood over a pot of grits, slowly stirring with the same rhythm she'd used for the past 22 years. She liked to be the first one in. She liked the quiet before the noise. But this morning, the silence was broken by the tail end of a conversation between 2 young guards who had wandered in early for coffee. "You should have seen the guy," one of them said between chuckles. "He walked up like he owned the place." Rusk nearly choked laughing. Deborah didn't turn. Her spoon continued its slow circle. "I swear," the other added, "his ID was older than my mom. Looked like he laminated it himself back in the Cold War or something." And get this, the first one continued, lowering his voice, he had this envelope tucked under his arm like it was some top-secret mission. But Rusk told him to head to a museum. And the old guy just turned around. Didn't say a word. Deborah's hand slowed. Her knuckles tightened on the spoon handle. The pot bubbled softly, steam rising around her face. What did he look like? She asked without raising her voice. One of the guards blinked. Black, old, maybe mid-80s. Wore a brown hat. Not like a cap, but one of those soft felt ones. Looked like he meant something to him. Deborah carefully set the spoon down and wiped her hands on her apron. Her gaze fell on the stainless steel surface of the counter, but her mind was somewhere else. Her voice came out distant, almost as if she were narrating a memory to herself more than speaking to them. He was quiet. Didn't say much, the guard replied. Didn't fight back. Just left. Deborah nodded slowly. I think I saw him once before. A long time ago. Back when this place still smelled like gunpowder and broken promises. The guards exchanged a confused look. She leaned slightly against the counter, her eyes now far away. It was 1982. I was new then, only been at the mess a couple of months. There was an explosion at the fuel depot. Sirens, smoke, men running in every direction. Chaos. But I remember this one man, skinny, older even then, walking straight into the smoke like he didn't even hear the alarms. Everyone else ran the other way. But he went in. Came out dragging 3 men on his own like they weighed nothing. His uniform was soaked with blood and fire-retardant foam. He never said a word. Just laid them down, nodded at the medics, and walked away. Her voice drifted into silence. The guard stared at her, unsure if they should interrupt. I never caught his name, Deborah whispered, but I never forgot that face. Or that hat. Outside the mess hall, the base was slowly awakening to the whispers that had started inside the checkpoint booth. The photo of Elijah Monroe was spreading, not just on internal message boards but through quiet conversations between officers and staff, between cooks and clerks, between mechanics and medics. There was something about that image, an old man sitting beneath a tree, hat in lap, gaze fixed forward, that felt heavier than any uniform. Back in the booth, Torres paced. His cousin hadn't called back yet, but something gnawed at him deeper than unanswered questions. He glanced once more toward the bench. Elijah hadn't moved. Still. Still silent. It made Torres think again of his grandfather, who once told him that real warriors don't need to shout. Their silence was a language forged in fire and remembered in dreams. Inside his jacket pocket, Torres pulled out a slip of paper. On it, scribbled in pen, was the name, Elijah Monroe. No middle name. No rank. Just those 2 words and the growing realization that they meant more than anyone had assumed. He stared at the paper. Something about the name tickled a distant thread in his memory. A lecture? A footnote? A classified footlocker? He couldn't place it, but the weight of it was undeniable. Elijah Monroe wasn't just an old man with a story. He was the story, the one no one had written down, the one no one thought to preserve. Back in the mess, Deborah had stepped away from the kitchen, unnoticed by most, and made her way outside. She didn't need to ask where he was. Her feet knew. As she approached the edge of the parking lot, her eyes locked on the man beneath the sycamore tree. He hadn't seen her. But she saw him. She saw the hat. The posture. The envelope resting gently against his knee. She stopped a few yards away, not wanting to intrude. But her voice carried softly on the breeze. Was it you? She asked, more to herself than to him. Was it really you? Elijah didn't look up, didn't speak, but somehow she felt he'd heard her. Inside the communications building, a young officer named Harrison caught sight of the forum post that now had over 100 responses. He read through them quickly, snippets of memory, fragmented recognition, a few names from old missions whispered in digital text. Then his eyes stopped at one entry, written by a retired colonel from Virginia. If that's who I think it is, you need to check Operation Falcon Wing, 1972. And do it fast. This isn't just some vet. That man was a legend. Harrison's heart skipped. He opened the base archive system and typed in the words, Operation Falcon Wing. Access denied. Clearance level redacted. He paused. Then picked up the phone. Outside, Elijah Monroe blinked slowly, the morning light catching the faint silver in his beard. He wasn't waiting for recognition. He wasn't waiting for ceremony. He was simply here, because it was time. Because the names in his envelope hadn't been spoken aloud in decades. Because silence, sometimes, is the only thing left when the world forgets what it owes. But something had changed. A shift had begun. And somewhere deep in the walls of Fort Grantham, memories long buried were stirring. Inside the break room of the checkpoint building, Private Elio Torres sat with his phone pressed to his ear, the room around him blurred by the weight of the name he'd just whispered into the line. Elijah Monroe, he said again, his voice low, cautious. Born maybe in the late 30s. Probably served during Vietnam. Maybe even Korea. I'm guessing high rank. Marine Corps. Can you run that through anything you've got, Jordan? Quietly. His cousin Jordan, a civilian contractor working in military logistics out of Arlington, was quiet on the other end of the line. Then came a short exhale. I'll see what I can find, Jordan said. But if this guy's who you think he is, we may be dealing with files buried under more red tape than I've ever seen. Torres hung up and turned toward the window. Elijah Monroe still sat beneath the tree outside, unmoved by the noise of the base, the buzzing radios, or the quiet whirlwind of speculation building in his wake. He wasn't looking around, wasn't trying to catch anyone's attention. He simply sat, like a sentinel from another time, his silence louder than the voices mocking him earlier that morning. Inside the base's administrative center, Harrison, one of the junior communications officers, had seen the forum post about the mysterious veteran and couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than anyone realized. The comments kept pouring in. He looks like the guy from that training film in '84, one wrote. Another added, my dad told me about a Monroe who pulled guys out of a helicopter crash in Laos. Swore he wasn't real. A third said, check the name against Directive 117B. If he's under that, you'll hit a wall. That last comment sent chills down Harrison's spine. Directive 117B was a security clearance code used only for the most classified operations in U.S. military history, missions so secret even their funding lines were buried in budgets under unrelated departments. If Elijah Monroe was tied to anything under 117B, then the man sitting under that tree wasn't just a veteran. He was a ghost the government never expected to be seen again. Torres's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Jordan. Are you sure you want to dig into this? It read. I just got a hit. Access is locked. File name, Monroe, Elijah. Directive tag confirmed. Redacted across 4 branches. Clearance level Omega. Torres stared at the screen. Omega. The highest non-presidential classification level. Reserved only for legacy operatives who had either led cross-branch missions or had knowledge that could compromise national security. Torres reread the message 3 times before sliding the phone back into his pocket. He looked again toward Elijah, a man now dressed in nothing more than khakis and a brown wool jacket, a man who had been mocked for an expired ID, and realized he was looking at something the base had failed to recognize, a living fragment of history so deep it had been erased from all but the minds of a few. Down the hall, Harrison posted a follow-up comment beneath the original image, confirmed. This is not a drill. Veteran under Directive 117B. Anyone who knows someone in D.C., now's the time to make the call. And somewhere in D.C., someone did. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a conference room or a breaking news flash. It was a simple desk phone ringing in the Office of Special Operations Legacy under the Department of Defense. The man who picked up the receiver was Colonel Rene Langston, a name feared and respected in the upper echelons of Defense Command. He listened as the report was given. A veteran named Elijah Monroe had been turned away at Fort Grantham. He had presented an expired ID and left quietly. Then the photos started to surface. The description. The brown hat. The cane with the Marine Corps emblem. The envelope. Langston's hand tightened on the phone. Get me Fort Grantham's checkpoint. Now. Back at the base, Private Torres stood inside the booth when the secure line rang. He glanced at the screen and froze. Pentagon, priority. He snatched the receiver. Private Torres speaking, he said, trying to keep his voice even. This is Colonel Rene Langston, the voice replied, cold and precise. Put me on speaker. Now. Torres didn't hesitate. He turned toward Lieutenant Rusk, who had just returned from bragging about the incident in the locker room. Sir, it's DC. Colonel Langston. He wants you on speaker. Rusk rolled his eyes as he walked over. This is Lieutenant Rusk, he said, casual, almost amused. How can you are now on speaker, Langston's voice cut through like a blade. Lieutenant Rusk, as of this moment, you are to treat the man you turned away, Sergeant Major Elijah Monroe, with full honors. You are speaking of a man whose service predates your birth, whose operational record spans 4 branches of the United States military and includes classified missions still redacted to this day. The room went still. Even the background chatter from radio seemed to hush. Rusk's smirk evaporated. His face turned pale. Sir, I wasn't aware. No, Langston snapped. You weren't. You saw an old man with a weathered ID and made a joke of him. That man led Operation Falcon Wing in 1972. He commanded the rescue of 27 American POWs from North Vietnam without a single casualty. His clearance under Directive 117B remains active. Indefinitely. No one moved. No one breathed. Rusk opened his mouth but said nothing. Sergeant Baines stumbled forward. Wait. That Elijah Monroe? Yes, Langston said. And you humiliated him at your gate. Even as those words settled, a deep hum echoed outside. An unmarked black military SUV pulled up to the gate, dust trailing behind it. The doors opened, and 3 high-ranking officers stepped out in full dress uniform. At their center was Colonel Isaac Greer, a towering presence with eyes like storm clouds and a voice that never needed to rise above a whisper to demand obedience. He stepped forward. Where is Sergeant Major Monroe? He asked. Rusk pointed with a trembling hand toward the tree at the edge of the lot. Greer nodded once. Prepare for honors protocol, he said, and without another word, he strode toward Elijah. Inside the booth, silence held everyone captive. Torres glanced at the others. No one said a word. Rusk stood stiff, his expression a mask of shame and disbelief. Baines looked like she wanted to vanish. And outside, the quiet figure beneath the sycamore tree remained seated, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, that the past was rising to meet him. Torres stepped forward, whispering as Greer passed, I told you this wasn't over. The colonel didn't reply. He didn't have to. The moment was speaking for him. It was a moment that would live on long after the last salute faded into morning light. A moment when a forgotten name had begun to echo through the ranks again. A name that now demanded reverence. Elijah Monroe. Colonel Isaac Greer didn't break stride as he crossed the pavement, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence that had fallen over the checkpoint. Behind him, the honor detail followed, 2 decorated officers whose polished dress uniforms shimmered in the morning light. Their presence alone turned heads across the base, but it was Greer's face, stern, unshaken, resolute, that broadcast the gravity of the moment more than any uniform ever could. The guards at the booth remained frozen, their earlier arrogance now replaced by a haunting realization. Rusk's throat was dry, his hands trembling slightly as the weight of his mistake sank deeper with every second. Torres kept his eyes locked on Greer's back, heart pounding as if he were watching something historical unfold, not from the past, but from the present, finally acknowledging what had been there all along. Greer approached the bench without speaking. Elijah Monroe didn't look up. He'd heard the SUV, felt the sudden change in the air, but he remained still, both hands resting on the head of his cane. Greer stopped a step away and raised his hand in a slow, formal salute, his posture as rigid and reverent as if he were in the presence of a general. Elijah raised his head at last, his eyes meeting Greer's. He studied him for a moment, then returned the salute, measured and calm, as though muscle memory alone had summoned the motion. It was quiet, but the silence around them spoke volumes. "Elijah," Greer said finally, his voice soft but brimming with restrained emotion. "Sir," Elijah replied with a simple nod. Greer lowered his hand. "I am here to escort you. Full honors. Your presence has been requested at the memorial courtyard." Elijah glanced toward the gate. "They still keep it polished?" he asked. "Every day," Greer answered. "But it's never been as sharp as it'll be today." With a small effort, Elijah rose to his feet. He tucked the envelope back under his arm and adjusted his jacket. He didn't need assistance, but Greer remained beside him, a silent shadow of respect. Together they began walking, slowly but steadily, toward the gate. As they passed the booth, Torres stepped aside, standing at attention. Rusk tried to swallow the lump in his throat. He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Elijah didn't look at him. He didn't need to. The air between them said enough. Greer paused just long enough to glance back at the checkpoint team. "For your information," he said, turning toward the gathered soldiers, "that ID card you mocked contains a passive transmitter. It activates once a year, on Veterans Day. That's how we know he's still alive." Rusk blinked, stunned. You track him?" "We honor him," Greer said sharply, "because Sergeant Major Monroe never asked for recognition. He only wanted to be sure we remembered those who didn't come home." Word spread across Fort Grantham like a fire sparked in dry brush. Radios buzzed. Phones lit up. Uniforms were pressed. Medals were pinned. What had begun as a whisper now moved through the barracks, offices, and hallways with urgency. Staff sergeants shouted orders. Lieutenants adjusted formations. Cooks dropped ladles and grabbed cameras. The honor corridor was forming. Soldiers lined the path from the gate to the memorial courtyard. Some still didn't fully understand what was happening, only that the base had shifted into a ceremonial stance not seen since the retirement of a commanding general 5 years prior. But this wasn't about a command. It was about a man. As Elijah approached the beginning of the corridor, the air grew still. Hundreds of soldiers snapped to attention, boots striking the pavement in perfect sync. Some had only heard fragments of the story, but it didn't matter. They could feel it. The quiet dignity of the man who now walked between them spoke louder than any marching band or bugle ever could. His cane was tucked beneath one arm. His other hand rested lightly over the envelope, fingers tightening as the crowd swelled along the edges of the courtyard. Greer walked beside him, silent, allowing the moment to breathe. Officers stood shoulder to shoulder with new recruits. Logistics staff and mechanics wiped grease from their hands and lined up beside kitchen workers still in aprons. And at the very end of the corridor, directly before the memorial wall, a single podium stood empty, its microphone already live but unused. Greer turned to Elijah and spoke with deep reverence. "They're waiting for you, Sergeant Major." Elijah didn't speak. He didn't need to. He continued forward, and as he passed Lieutenant Rusk, now standing at rigid attention, eyes locked forward, something passed between them, a weight heavier than shame, heavier than regret. It was understanding. Rusk felt it settle on his chest like the full weight of a name he had misjudged, a man he had overlooked, a legacy he had dismissed with a joke. They reached the memorial wall. Elijah paused, his gaze falling on the names carved deep into its smooth, dark surface. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the envelope, and gently placed it at the base of the wall. Then, slowly, he knelt, not out of age or fatigue, but reverence. His hand reached out and rested lightly on the names. His fingers traced the etchings as though reading them in Braille. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. But the hush that fell across the courtyard was sacred. When he finally rose, a single voice cut through the stillness, strong and clear. "Sergeant Major on deck." In perfect unison, the entire base snapped to attention. Boots locked. Salutes raised. Not out of protocol. Not out of chain of command. But out of something deeper. Respect. Earned and long overdue. As the wind whispered through the flags overhead and the sun illuminated the edge of Elijah Monroe's silhouette, the base stood together. Not for a ceremony, not for a photo op, but for a man who had once stood alone, year after year, remembering names the world had forgotten. And now, at last, the world was remembering him. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The courtyard stood frozen, not in fear or confusion, but in reverence. The echoes of the last salute still lingered like smoke in the air, and no one dared to break the silence that had descended like a veil over Fort Grantham. Sergeant Major Elijah Monroe remained at the base of the memorial wall, his hands still resting on the names of the fallen, his eyes half closed, not from exhaustion but from a flood of memory that only he could see. Around him, the living formed a circle of quiet acknowledgement. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the whispering wind and the distant metallic clink of flags against their poles. For most, the wall was a monument, a reminder of sacrifice etched in stone. But for Elijah, it was a conversation, a place where he came each year not to mourn, but to fulfill a promise. Colonel Isaac Greer stepped back respectfully, allowing Elijah the space he needed. The envelope lay untouched at the foot of the wall, resting against the marble like an offering placed at an altar. Greer knew what it meant. They all did now. It wasn't just a letter. It was the latest in a series of unspoken confessions, year after year, delivered without fanfare, without anyone watching. Only this year, the world had finally paused long enough to see the man behind the ritual. Slowly, Elijah turned from the wall. He didn't look for applause or approval. He didn't search the crowd. He simply let his gaze sweep gently across the rows of uniforms and solemn faces. Then, with a voice that was quiet but unshakable, he began to speak. "I didn't come here for applause," Elijah said, the weight of decades wrapped in each syllable. "I came to deliver these." He nodded toward the envelope. "They're letters. One for each of them. I've written one every year. Told their families what kind of men they were. What they did. What they gave." The word struck the crowd like a slow wave. No one moved. A few glanced at each other, but most kept their eyes locked on Elijah, their bodies still at attention, their minds trying to imagine what kind of man carries 18 unwritten eulogies in silence for over 40 years. "I never mailed them," Elijah added. "Didn't think anyone would care." He paused, his eyes distant. And then, from behind him, Colonel Greer stepped forward and gently placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "They did, Sergeant Major," Greer said. Elijah turned, startled. Greer nodded. "We've been retrieving your letters every Veterans Day. The names and addresses on those envelopes. They weren't just symbols. We delivered every one." A gasp spread through the courtyard, but no one dared to speak. Elijah blinked. For the first time all day, his composure wavered. His eyes welled, not from weakness, but from the unexpected release of years carried in silence. "You delivered them," he whispered. "Yes, sir," Greer replied. "Every year. Some families have kept every letter. Some read them aloud at dinner. Some framed them. Some buried them beside the graves." The hush grew deeper, heavier. It was no longer just the silence of respect. It was the silence of revelation. Of truth cutting through years of neglect and replacing it with meaning. Torres, still standing at the far edge of the formation, felt his breath catch. He had known something about Elijah was different. He had seen it in the man's walk, in his stillness, in the way he didn't flinch when laughed at. But hearing it now, spoken plainly before the entire base, confirmed what his heart had already told him. Elijah Monroe had never been forgotten. He had simply never asked to be remembered. At the back of the gathering, Lieutenant Mason Rusk stood rigid, his jaw tight, his chest hollow with the bitter taste of guilt. He had seen the same man as everyone else, but he had mocked what he didn't understand. And now, standing in the long shadow of truth, he felt the full weight of what he had done. He stepped forward hesitantly, breaking from the formation. Elijah turned slightly as Rusk approached, his eyes calm, unreadable. "I'm sorry," Rusk said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Elijah studied him for a long moment before responding. "You saw a man," he said. "But you didn't see the weight he carried." Rusk swallowed hard. "I see it now." Elijah nodded once, then turned back to the wall. The crowd parted slowly, allowing him to pass without escort. He didn't need one. His steps were steady, sure, as if the ground itself honored each footfall. And as he moved past the rows of saluting soldiers, the unspoken message was clear. This was not just about service. It was about recognition long delayed, respect hard-earned, and dignity restored not by ceremony, but by truth finally heard. At the gate, the brass plate had already been removed from the "invalid credentials" box. Torres had taken it down himself. He held it in his hands, staring at the words that had once dismissed a legend. With a quiet breath, he dropped it into a nearby trash bin. Across the courtyard, a maintenance officer took measurements for a new sign to be installed at the main entrance. It would read, "Elijah Monroe Gate." Beneath it, in smaller lettering, "For the quiet valor we almost didn't see." Elijah reached the edge of the crowd, where the sunlight was beginning to stretch across the flagstone. He paused one last time and looked over his shoulder. Hundreds of eyes met his. No one spoke. But everyone understood. Then, with a small nod, Elijah adjusted his brown hat, tucked the envelope firmly under his arm, and walked into the light. And for the first time in years, the silence behind him was not of absence, but of reverence. Not of forgetting, but of finally remembering. Elijah returned to the memorial wall later that afternoon when the sun had shifted and the crowd had dispersed, leaving only the soft rustle of the flags and the fading scent of boot polish in the courtyard. No one had asked him to come back. No one ordered a ceremony. But the moment called him, as it had every year. This time, though, he was not alone in the physical sense. Behind the windows of nearby buildings, through cracked doors and camera lenses, eyes followed him, not out of curiosity, but reverence. He walked slowly, methodically, his cane tucked beneath his arm again, the brown envelope still in hand, worn now from years of being handled but never opened by anyone but him. As he approached the wall, the engraved names shimmered faintly in the angled sunlight, catching the reflection of a man who had never stopped carrying them in his heart. He reached the center, where the names were grouped not by alphabet or rank but by operation. Operation Falcon Wing. 19 soldiers. One of them had died after returning home, years later, from complications no one could explain. That left 18, all of them listed there, etched in the same clean font, beneath the same polished stone. Elijah knelt again, not because it made a statement, but because it had become part of the ritual. His knees touched the cool stone path as he leaned forward and placed the envelope at the foot of the wall once more. His fingers, thickened by time and tremor, reached up to trace the names. He didn't need to read them. He already knew each one. Their voices, their laughter, their last words, he carried them like a sacred burden. The wind picked up slightly, catching the edge of his hat, but he didn't reach for it. He remained still, one hand on the stone, one resting on his knee. Around him, the bass grew quieter. The day's normal rhythm had slowed, halted by the weight of something larger than routine. Inside the operations center, a young radio technician named Miles stood watching the feed from the courtyard, his hands hovering over the control panel but doing nothing. He wasn't recording. He wasn't transmitting. He was just watching. Something about the way Elijah moved, slow, intentional, reverent, made even pressing a button feel intrusive. Back outside, Elijah began to speak, not to anyone around him, but to the names themselves. "I came back," he whispered. "Just like I promised." He paused and let the silence wrap around him. "I wrote again. This one, it was harder." His voice cracked slightly, worn down not by age but by the repetition of memory. "You'd be proud," he continued. "Your families, they remember. They read the letters. They cry. They laugh. Sometimes both at once." He leaned his forehead gently against the stone, the polished marble cool against his skin. The image of him, small against the towering wall, looked more like a sculpture than a man. But inside him, a lifetime moved, battles fought, men lost, guilt buried and unearthed again with each visit. Behind him, a soft sound broke the air. It was a boot, carefully stepping onto the path. Then another. Elijah didn't move. He knew who it was before he turned. Colonel Greer stopped a few feet behind him and waited. After a long moment, Elijah stood, slowly, deliberately, brushing dust from his trousers. He turned to face Greer, who held a folded flag beneath his arm. "We found it," Greer said. Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Found what?" "The helmet," Greer replied. "Private First Class Lyle Heron. His family kept it all these years. His sister mailed it this morning. Said she wanted you to have it." Elijah swallowed, his jaw tightening. He was the youngest. 17 when we pulled him out. Lyle liked crossword puzzles and singing in the mess. I told his mother he never stopped smiling, even when the bullets came. Greer nodded, his voice quieter now. "She said that letter changed her life. Said it gave her back a part of him she thought she'd never know." Elijah closed his eyes. "I only ever wanted them to be remembered as more than names on a wall." "And they are," Greer said. "Because of you." A light breeze moved through the trees, stirring the leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, a low, ceremonial chime from the chapel tower. Not for a service. Just part of the rhythm of the day. But here, in this moment, it felt like an amen. Elijah took the flag from Greer and held it in his arms for a long while. He didn't unfold it. He just stood with it, like he was holding something living. Then he turned back to the wall one more time. "Same time next year," he whispered. "You know I'll come." Behind him, the faint murmur of voices could be heard again. Not laughter, not mockery, but whispers of acknowledgement. A few younger soldiers had gathered at the courtyard's edge, some with hats removed, some with hands folded, unsure whether to step forward or remain back. One of them, a corporal named Jensen, walked up slowly, eyes wide. "Sergeant Major Monroe," he said softly, "do you mind if I," he gestured toward the envelope. "May I read one of the letters someday?" Elijah studied the young man's face. He saw sincerity there. Humility. The kind of quiet curiosity that carried the seeds of legacy. He gave a single nod. "Someday," he said. "But first, you write your own." Jensen nodded, blinking back the heat in his eyes. Then he stepped back. Elijah looked toward Greer, who stood watching with something like awe on his face. "You always walk like you know the way," Greer said. "Because I've been carrying the map," Elijah replied. And with that, he turned and made his way down the path, past the wall, past the benches, past the guards who now saluted him without being told. He didn't pause to thank them. He didn't need to. The path was clear. The weight he carried was still heavy, but for the first time in years, it was shared. And that made all the difference. The sun dipped lower across Fort Grantham as golden light stretched its fingers over the brick walls and flag-lined walkways. The courtyard now stood empty, except for scattered leaves and the lingering echoes of boots that had snapped to attention earlier in the day. Though the ceremony was over and the formation had disbanded, the story of Elijah Monroe still hung heavy in the air. It passed from whisper to whisper, from soldier to clerk, each voice repeating what the other had just begun to believe. And somewhere beneath that collective reverence, something deeper stirred, an awakening, not just of memory, but of responsibility. Lieutenant Mason Rusk stood in the shadows of the command wing, his uniform perfectly pressed, his posture stiff. His usual confidence had drained from his body, replaced by something far more fragile and difficult to hold. Regret. He had stood through the entire ceremony earlier, every step Elijah had taken, every name whispered, every hand that raised in salute had carved another notch into his conscience. Now, as the base returned to its routines, Rusk remained outside the door, unsure whether he had the right to knock. Inside, Elijah Monroe sat in the commander's office, not behind the desk but beside the window, watching as twilight edged over the trees. The brown envelope rested on his lap again, slightly more creased now, but still sealed. Colonel Isaac Greer stood near the door, quietly organizing a few folders, though his attention remained on Elijah. Neither man had spoken for a while. There was no need to fill the silence. It had its own meaning. Finally, the door opened, and Lieutenant Rusk stepped in. He removed his cap, held it at his side, and paused just inside the threshold. His eyes found Elijah's and held there, searching for something, permission, perhaps, or simply courage. Greer glanced at Elijah, who gave a small nod. "Come in, Lieutenant," Greer said. Rusk approached slowly, each step weighted with more than the pressure of military boots. He came to a halt a few feet from Elijah, standing at a position not quite at attention but far from casual. "Sergeant Major," he began, his voice softer than anyone on base had ever heard it. "I need to say something." Elijah didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at the young officer with eyes that had seen men break, seen them fall, seen them rise again stronger. He waited. Rusk took a breath. "I failed you this morning. I mocked what I didn't understand. I dismissed you because your ID was old and your clothes weren't regulation. I treated you like someone who didn't belong here, when in truth, this base exists because of men like you." He stopped himself, his throat tightening. "I've trained for years to lead. I've studied tactics, read manuals, memorized code. But nothing prepared me for the kind of leadership you demonstrated just by standing at that gate." Elijah's gaze remained steady. Rusk continued. "You didn't raise your voice. You didn't demand respect. You didn't even ask for a second chance. But you carried something none of us saw. And I'm sorry for that, for not seeing it." For a moment, the room was still. Elijah finally spoke, his voice calm and clear. "You saw a man. But you didn't see the weight he carried." Rusk nodded. "I see it now." Elijah looked toward the window for a long moment, then back at Rusk. "What you do with what you see next is what matters." Those words settled in Rusk's chest like iron. He understood what was being offered, not forgiveness as a favor, but the chance to change as a duty. He straightened his posture slightly, not in defense, but in respect. "I will, sir," he said. "I'll change." Elijah gave a single nod, then turned to Colonel Greer. "It's always about the next one," he said. "That's how we make sure it wasn't in vain." Greer stepped forward, placing a hand briefly on Rusk's shoulder before returning to his post. The moment had passed, but its weight lingered. Later that evening, Elijah walked across the base unescorted. The air had cooled, and the stars had begun to blink into view. Everywhere he passed, soldiers paused to watch him. Some saluted. Others nodded silently. None spoke. He passed the chapel, where candles glowed behind stained glass. He passed the barracks, where men and women sat on steps, quietly recounting the story of the day. And then he reached the gate, the very same one where hours earlier he had been turned away. Private Elio Torres was there, standing beside the booth. When he saw Elijah approach, he stepped forward without hesitation. "Sergeant Major," he said. "It's an honor to see you again." Elijah smiled faintly. "You were the only one who didn't laugh." Torres looked down. "I saw my grandfather in you." Elijah nodded, his eyes softening. "He served Korea." "He never talked about it. But he carried it. Just like you." Elijah placed a hand on Torres's shoulder. "Then you know what it means to listen without words." Torres stood a little taller. "Yes, sir." As Elijah turned to go, Torres called out once more. "Thank you. For not letting us forget." Elijah didn't reply with words. He simply raised his hand in a quiet salute, then lowered it as he walked into the night. Behind him, Fort Grantham stood changed. Not because of what was written in a file, not because of a ceremony, but because they had finally seen him, not just the man, but the message he carried. And though the sun had set, something had been lit that would not be extinguished. Not in the hearts of those who watched him go, and not in the legacy of the names he would forever whisper in the silence. The main hall of Fort Grantham had never been this full on such short notice. Folding chairs had been brought in from 3 different buildings, filling every open space between columns and beneath the long row of windows that framed the western wall. The evening light filtered through those windows in rich golden beams, casting soft halos across the polished floor. Over 200 soldiers had gathered, some still in partial uniform, others in t-shirts and fatigue pants, but all were quiet. The usual chatter and teasing that filled gatherings like these had vanished. In its place was a sense of reverent expectancy, as if everyone instinctively knew they were about to witness something they would never forget. Colonel Isaac Greer stood at the front, behind a simple wooden podium that had been hurriedly moved into place. He wasn't a man given to long speeches, and tonight was no exception. He glanced over the crowd, recognizing faces. Privates barely out of training, sergeants with salt in their beards, a few lieutenants with the stiffness of youth still lingering in their posture. He nodded once and began. "Today," he said, "you didn't just meet history. You stood in its presence." The word settled over the room like a blanket. Then Greer stepped aside. A quiet rustle of fabric followed as Elijah Monroe rose from the front row. He walked to the podium with the same pace he had used all day, not slow from weakness, but steady with purpose. His brown hat was held respectfully in one hand. His jacket, though plain, seemed to carry the weight of metals unseen. As he reached the podium, no one moved. The silence deepened. Elijah looked at the sea of faces before him. Young faces. Unlined by war, but not untouched by duty. He saw their posture, the way they leaned slightly forward. They weren't waiting for inspiration. They were searching for understanding. "I'm no hero," he began, his voice low and calm. "Just a man who kept his promises." He let that hang there for a moment. "You've been taught that honor comes with rank. With ribbons. With recognition," he continued. "But real honor shows up when no one's watching. It's in the way you treat a stranger. Even one who looks like they don't belong." A ripple passed through the crowd, quiet but unmistakable. I came here today because I owed something, Elijah said. Not to this base. Not to the flag, though I love it. I owed something to 18 names on a wall. Names that most of you never heard. Men who followed me into places darker than most of you will ever know. Men who never asked for medals. Just a chance to come home. He paused again and looked down for a moment. For years, I came here alone. Left a letter. No parades. No speeches. Just silence. And I was fine with that. Because I wasn't writing those letters for me. I was writing them for the families who never stopped waiting. Somewhere near the back, a young recruit blinked away tears. He'd only been on base for 2 weeks, but something about the man before him made his spine straighten. You know what I learned? Elijah continued. You don't need a title to carry dignity. You don't need permission to do what's right. And you sure as hell don't need to wait for applause before standing up for someone who can't speak anymore. He looked directly at Rusk, who stood to the side, his hands clasped behind his back. There was no anger in Elijah's eyes. Only truth. Some of you saw an old man today, he said. But what you didn't see was the fire still burning beneath the years. The oath that never expired. The memory of each man I lost, and the promise that I would not let them disappear. He stepped back from the podium then, and the room didn't erupt in thunderous applause. It didn't need to. Instead, every person stood in quiet unison, not clapping, but saluting. One by one, from the back row to the front, hands rose in perfect sync, a wall of respect standing in front of a man who had spent his life kneeling for others. Afterward, when the chairs were being put away and the sun had dipped fully below the horizon, Rusk approached him. This time, his steps were not stiff with duty or shame. They were tempered by change. Sergeant Major, he said, voice steady but subdued, I failed you. Elijah looked at him, his expression calm. No. You failed yourself. Rusk nodded slowly, accepting the correction without defense. But I heard what you said. About what comes next. I'll carry that. I'll teach it. I'll live it. Elijah studied him, then gave a small approving nod. Then that's enough. It was not a grand reconciliation. No sweeping moment of absolution. Just 2 men, one older, one younger, standing in the thin space between what had been and what could be. That night, as the base quieted into rest, soldiers gathered in small clusters. Some shared pieces of Elijah's words, others sat in silence, staring at the stars. A few even walked to the memorial wall, now illuminated by soft lights, and stood before it without speaking. Not because they knew the names. But because now, they understood why they mattered. And tucked into a quiet office, Elijah sat alone for a moment, his fingers resting on the last envelope he had written. The one that was never meant to be read by just one person. He smiled faintly, folded it, and placed it into a leather-bound journal. Then he wrote 4 words on the first page. Honor endures through memory. And in that moment, with no one watching, he fulfilled another promise. The fog rolled in gently over the town of Briar Ridge, curling like smoke across the gravel roads and draping itself over the rooftops in soft silence. It was Veterans Day once again, a year after the salute that had shaken Fort Grantham to its core. The same black military SUV turned slowly into a modest driveway framed by a weathered picket fence. It didn't need to honk. It didn't even need to stop for long. Sergeant Major Elijah Monroe was already standing on the front porch, brown hat in hand, jacket zipped halfway, eyes calm and knowing as if he had been waiting there his entire life for this moment to return. The young officer who stepped out of the SUV barely looked old enough to shave, but his movements were crisp, respectful. He stood tall, snapped to attention, and saluted with precision. Sergeant Major, he said. Permission to accompany you, sir. Elijah gave a faint smile, his nod slow and deliberate. Permission granted. It had become a tradition since that unforgettable day at Fort Grantham. Each year, the Pentagon sent a driver and a companion, always someone new, always someone eager to learn in silence what no book could teach. The ride was quiet, but not empty. The road seemed to carry memory with it, each passing mile humming with stories left unsaid. As they approached the base, the young officer glanced at Elijah's lap and saw the envelope again. Same color. Same size. Same careful fold at the edge. "Do you always write by hand?" he asked, his voice tentative. Elijah turned to him with a softness in his eyes. "Every year. The words matter more when you feel them leaving your fingertips." The officer nodded, unsure what to say next. Do you ever run out of things to say?" Elijah looked out the window. "Not when you remember who you're writing to." When they arrived at the gate, the guards were already at attention. The plaque that now read, "Elijah Monroe Gate," gleamed in the early morning mist. Below it, smaller text caught the light, "For the quiet valor we almost didn't see." Elijah stepped out of the SUV without needing help, his movements slower now but still measured with dignity. As he approached the courtyard, the honor corridor formed once again, not out of obligation but instinct. Soldiers snapped to position, saluting one by one as he passed, and civilians removed their hats, placing them against their chests. No band played. No speeches were planned. Yet every face was turned toward him as if waiting for a sacred moment to arrive. At the center of the courtyard, the memorial wall stood unchanged, polished, solemn, unyielding in its quiet witness to sacrifice. Elijah stepped toward it alone, his brown shoes whispering across the stone path. When he reached the wall, he knelt once more, slower now, one knee trembling slightly before settling on the ground. He reached out, fingers brushing over the carved names with the same reverence as he had done for decades. Then he opened the envelope. Inside was a single page, folded neatly. He didn't read it aloud, but he held it there for a moment, as if letting the names see it first. He placed it at the base of the wall, flattening it gently with the palm of his hand. His other hand rested against the names. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. But the silence that surrounded him was heavy, thick with the weight of everything he had never said. A few steps behind him, Colonel Greer stood with his cap in hand, watching with a solemn expression. He had made the trip from Washington personally, refusing to let anyone else stand in that space. He knew what was coming, though he dreaded it in a way that tightened his throat. As Elijah rose, he turned toward the colonel and nodded once. "This one's the last," he said softly. "Last?" Greer asked. Elijah didn't answer at first. He looked up at the flag, watching it ripple in the morning wind. "I've written every letter I needed to. There's peace in that." Greer's voice caught slightly. "You'll still come next year?" Elijah looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small smile. "Maybe not in person. But I'll be here." That night, Elijah returned home in silence. He didn't stay for interviews or photographs. He didn't linger at the gate. He simply stepped back into the quiet of his modest house, sat at his desk, and began to write one last time. This letter was different. It wasn't addressed to any soldier, living or dead. It was addressed to those who might one day forget why remembering mattered. He folded it carefully, sealed it, and wrote on the front in black ink, "For the ones I couldn't save." He passed away in his sleep a few weeks later. No headlines marked his departure. No news anchors mentioned his name. But on his desk, the envelope remained. It was found by the same young officer who had driven him that last Veterans Day. The envelope was opened only after it was brought to Fort Grantham and laid at the memorial wall with full military protocol. Inside was a message that would live on far beyond the paper it was written on. "Honor does not fade," it began. "It only needs one person to remember. Justice may arrive late, but it is never absent. And the right thing is always worth doing, even when no one is watching." The letter was framed and placed inside the base chapel. Every new recruit at Fort Grantham is now required to read it during their first week of training. And every year, on Veterans Day, the honor corridor forms once again, not because someone told them to, but because Elijah Monroe taught them that some legacies don't live in statues or medals. They live in footsteps, in silence, in the way one man kept a promise no one asked him to keep. To this day, the Elijah Monroe Gate stands unshaken. And those who pass beneath it are reminded not of a hero who demanded respect, but of one who carried it quietly, year after year, so the fallen would never truly be alone. Because some warriors leave behind medals. Others leave behind legacies written in silence. And some, like Elijah, leave a message that echoes in every name carved on that wall. You don't need a title to stand with dignity. You just need the courage to never let it go. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?